Welcome, Philip. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me on, Sven. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So you are a designer, a creative director, a marketer, and a strategic brand developer. You're the founder of Verhal Brand Design, which means story brand design, right? And
That's right.
For over 20 years, you've helped Fortune 100 companies and entrepreneurs establishing their brands. That's pretty amazing. From a branding and design standpoint, what made this company so successful?
Well, for one thing, they adopted a very specific and memorable advertising style. For one thing, so they had this very quirky television advertising, which was very retro. It was kind of retro Americana. And their store, the retail experience was super fun. Their mannequins were kind of more cartoony than realistic. They had themed stores, so there were like these old vintage trucks in the store and wood crates, and so the retail experience was awesome. The other thing about it that was great was that the fashion that we were selling was very on trend. It was kind of like it was like Gap, but fast fashion. It was kind of in between H&M and the Gap. It was kind of American staples, but done in a very trendy way, but also really, really affordable, much more affordable than even the Gap. So all of those things combined really created, I think, that success factor. We also, it was a memorable name. Old Navy is kind of a memorable name. We also promoted ourselves heavily on television, radio, and because our graphic apparel business was so strong, we also did a ton of what we called, we called them generic T-shirts, where basically they were branded Old Navy. So we had hundreds and hundreds of designs with Old Navy on the chest. And so what that does is it creates a walking gallery of advertising as people are walking around with your logo or your artwork that says Old Navy on the chest. And so people learn about it and recognize it and remember it much, much faster. And in branding and design, I talk about the 3 R's a lot. The 3 R's are being recognized, being remembered, and being revered. And so in order to be recognized, you have to be visible and you have to show up a lot. And if you show up a lot and consistently enough, then you're remembered. And then if you deliver a great product or service experience, you develop that brand affinity and you're revered by your customers. So I think that the right out of the gate, the fact that they had that infrastructure of Gap, they had the physical retail, real estate aspect where they could get and build large stores very quickly. And then they also had that knowledge around branding that had made the Gap and Banana Republic very famous, and they just applied it to this new brand. In brand strategy, you start off with what are the physical attributes of what it is that you produce, whether that's a product or whether it's service. What is the thing, right? What are you delivering? And then as soon as you establish what that is, you have to start thinking about what is the functional benefit? What is the benefit that the end user is going to be getting from this? Those are the first kind of 2 stages of doing business. You have to figure out what your product or service is, what that value proposition, what that value is that you're delivering to your customer, and what we call in the industry, their need state. What do they need? What's that need that they have that needs to be fulfilled? As soon as you start fulfilling that need with your product or service with its functional benefits, you start thinking about what are the emotional benefits of that product or service. What are they getting out of it at an emotional level? Because as you build any company, or as you start thinking about building your brand or that brand affinity, you have to start thinking about what are the emotional what's the emotional benefits? What's the emotional resonance that you are starting to create in your customers? And then as that moves up the ladder, you start to think about how does that translate to my brand's personality? What is my brand's voice? What is my brand's, how do we go to market? What do we look like? What do we sound like? What do we act like? Those are the sorts of things that start to establish what your brand is. And when I counsel entrepreneurs, it's important to put a stake in the ground to say, this is what I'm planning on doing. This is the sort of culture and emotional benefit and connection, authentic connection that I'm looking to make with my customers, and to be super planful about that. Because if you just go out and let your brand establish itself, or you just put your product out there and let people, experience it the way they will, they're going to build your brand for you. And you really want to have a little more influence on what you're intending to do than just letting the market determine who you are. Understood that, especially in the software industry where the idea of minimum viable product was birthed, is that you put a product out into the world and it's half baked. And as users use it and find out what they really like about it, or what the feature of it is that's the most important thing to them, you iterate and build and change and kind of craft it into the thing that's going to service them the best. But by the same token, when you go out of the gate, when you launch into the market, you have to have some sort of level of understanding and intent on what you want to deliver, even if you are opening it up to the market to help inform what you evolve into, essentially. Part of this, Sven, relates directly to brand strategy, and the fact that when you do brand strategy, you try to establish a brand personality. And that is a brand tone of voice, a brand look and feel. What are the human characteristics of a company, of a brand, that a user, a consumer, can relate to on a personal level, on a human level? Because that's when you start to make that really close, kind of tribe-like, cult-like connection between a brand, an inanimate company, and a human being. You have to start kind of fostering a human personality to a brand so people can relate to it. And that's essentially what you're doing by becoming visible as the owner, is you are establishing a real human, personality, vision, style to your brand, which makes it easier for people to relate to.
In the context of branding, how do you think about podcast formats in general? Is it a good idea for an entrepreneur to create a podcast? Obviously, you have your own yourself, and why do you think is it a good idea?
Well, I think it's one of the things about podcasting as opposed to video is it's all about how people prefer to consume their content. Some people prefer to read, so they go on Twitter. They like to read the LinkedIn, Facebook feed. There are people who like to watch videos, who put that on the screen in the background and do their work, and they like that visual aspect. There are people who like podcasts because they can consume it while they're driving, or while they're walking their dog, or they're on the treadmill. And so, to a certain extent, some of it is about your audience and how they would prefer to consume content. In my case, it's kind of interesting. I'll just tell a very quick story, in the fact that I first of all started a newsletter and produced that for about 6 months before starting my YouTube channel, which I've now run for almost 5 years. And when I started to, after about 2 or 3 years, I did a survey of my email list from my newsletter and about how they consumed content, and I looked at the demographics. And I realized that my YouTube audience was about 80% under 35. And then readers of my newsletter were about 80% over 35. And so there was a very, very clear split between how people were consuming the content that I was putting out. And when I did a survey and asked that question of how they loved to consume content of my newsletter folks, they all preferred podcasts. So I realized that I was losing my 35-year-old plus audience. They were reading my newsletter, but they weren't consuming my YouTube content. They were getting no other content from me. So that's one of the reasons why I decided to develop a podcast, because I knew that in order to reach and get my message across to those 35-plus-year-old people who were more mature in their branding and creative careers, I was going to have to produce some audio content through a podcast. So that was a very conscious and deliberate decision on my part with my brand, because I I got some consumer insight, some true data around how my audience liked to consume my content. And I followed and I was directed by that preference. And so when you're starting off, to a certain extent, you pick a platform or two and you produce content, you look at the analytics, you get feedback from the people who are consuming it, and you pay very close attention to the traction that you're getting and try to gather that real quantitative data as much as you possibly can and have that help inform your decisions of where you show up.
That's interesting. So why do you think do people over 35 prefer podcasts?
Maybe they're just out busy doing more stuff. I think there's also a little bit of a cultural thing that, younger people have a tendency to want to be entertained. They look at more, they game more, so they're more gamers. They watch videos and video entertainment more. They're a little more prone to, I think the cat video set and the wacky entertainment sort of that you find on YouTube, that random, jokey kind of wacky content that is available on YouTube. Also probably, music videos, things of that nature. And so I think that they are attracted to video more, and they consume video more. And then people, when they get older and their lives get more complicated and they are working very hard and they have less free time where they can really concentrate on consuming something that's or listening to something that's more entertainment level or educational level. They have to fit it in where they can. So they're fitting it in when they're driving, or they're fitting it in when they're on exercising or walking their dog.
If you enjoyed this episode, hit the subscribe button and never miss an episode of Svencast again.